The name hit the room like a rifle shot. She chose this land and nobody is making her leave it. Clayton Barker's voice did not rise. It did not need to. He stood at the head of the long pine table in the Barker ranch house, both fists pressed flat against the wood, and every one of his four brothers understood in that moment that he was not making a suggestion. He was drawing a line in the red Texas dirt, and God help the man who stepped over it. His oldest brother, Hector, sat back in his chair and crossed his thick arms. The lamp on the table threw orange light across his jaw, across the deep crease between his brows that had been getting deeper every day since Effie Lawson had ridden through the gate of the Barker spread 3 weeks ago. "Clayton," Hector said slowly, the way a man talks when he is trying to sound reasonable and is failing. "The deed is not in her name. The banker in Harlow Creek says the loan is coming due in 30 days, and if she cannot pay it, the land reverts to the Calhoun family trust. That is not our doing, that is law. Then we change what we can change," Clayton said. His second brother, Wade, spread his hands on the table. "Change how? You going to ride into Harlow Creek and tell Preston Calhoun to forgive a $400 debt because you have got feelings for a woman who showed up here on a wagon with a broken axle and a deed that may or may not be legitimate?" The word stabbed at Clayton more than Wade had intended it to, he suspected. Because the question of that deed, the question of who Effie Lawson really was and what had brought her to the edge of the Barker land on that blistering July afternoon, had been eating a hole in his chest since the moment he had helped her climb down from that tilted wagon and looked into the darkest, steadiest pair of brown eyes he had ever seen in his 29 years of living. "Nobody said anything about feelings," Clayton said, and even he knew it was a lie so transparent it barely deserved air. Hector made a sound that was not quite a laugh. The youngest brother, 17-year-old Cass, kept his eyes on the table. The fourth brother, Emmett, who was 25 and generally the one most likely to keep the peace, looked at Clayton with something close to worry rather than challenge. "Brother," Emmett said quietly, "we are not the enemy here. We are asking questions because we do not want to see you walk into a trap." Clayton straightened. He pulled his hat from the peg on the wall behind him and set it on his head. "She did not trap me," he said. "She did not ask me for a single thing. She camped on the south pasture 2 nights before I even knew she was there, and when I found her she was mending fence posts that did not belong to her because they were falling onto what she believed was her property line." He moved toward the door. "A woman who mends fences in a Texas summer at sunrise does not have a hidden motive. She has grit, and this family has respected grit since before any of you were born." He walked out into the July night, and behind him the silence in the ranch house had a weight to it that pressed on every brother at that table differently. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. To understand why Clayton Barker would plant himself between a woman and his own blood, you have to go back to the morning 3 weeks before, when the Barker ranch was just a ranch and Effie Lawson was still a stranger. She had left Abilene, Kansas in the 3rd week of June, 1878, traveling south through Indian Territory and into North Texas with nothing more than a 2-horse wagon, a canvas bag of documents her father had left her when he died, a Winchester rifle she knew how to use, and a stubbornness that people who liked her called determination, and people who did not like her called dangerous. Her father, Edmund Lawson, had been a surveyor and a sometimes unlucky land speculator. He had died in the spring of that year from a chest infection that had stalked him since the previous winter, and the last thing he had pressed into Effie's hands was a land deed for 120 acres in Barrow County, Texas, purchased in 1871 from a man named Silas Calhoun. Edmund had never been able to work the land himself. There had always been another survey contract, another reason to delay, another season to wait. But he had kept the deed folded in his Bible, and when the fever took him, he had made Effie promise that she would go down there and see what could be made of it. Effie Lawson was 24 years old. She had spent her whole life following her father across the frontier, learning to read land surveys and stitch wounds and keep books and ride a horse and not apologize for any of it. She had dark hair that the wind at the top of a wagon seat could turn into a genuine catastrophe, and brown eyes that people sometimes described as fierce and other times described as sad. And the truth was they were both of those things at different moments of the same hour. She had no family except a half-cousin in Missouri she had not seen since childhood. She had $22, a deed, and a promise she had made to a dying man. The wagon axle cracked on a rut 12 miles north of Harlow Creek, in the late morning heat of July 3rd, and the horse on the left side, a bay mare she had named Dolly, stumbled and threw a shoe on the same bad stretch of road. Effie climbed down, assessed the situation with the particular calm of a person who has had bad situations before, and led both horses off the road and down toward a line of cottonwood trees she could see following a creek bed to the east. She found water, let the horses drink, and studied her father's hand-drawn map against the government survey lines she had memorized. By her best reckoning, she was already on or very near the edge of her own land. The property ran from the east bank of Millrace Creek south about a mile and then east 2 miles to a ridge of limestone outcrops her father had marked as the eastern boundary marker. She made camp under the cottonwoods, unhitched the horses, staked them on the creek grass, and spent the rest of that afternoon walking the fence lines she could reach on foot, testing posts, looking at the condition of the soil. The land was dry but not broken. There was a natural basin a quarter-mile south that collected runoff and might support a small pond with some grading work. The grass was sparse from the summer drought, but the root systems were intact. Her father's surveyor eye had been good even when his luck had not. She mended 3 fence posts that had fallen across what she was fairly certain was her property line, using wire she found in the back of the wagon, and a pair of pliers she always kept in her coat pocket, and she was pulling the wire tight on the 3rd post when she heard a horse and looked up. Clayton Barker was 29 years old and had been running the Barker Ranch since his father died 4 years ago, at which point the oldest brother, Hector, had astonished everyone by not wanting the job. Hector was a good man, but he liked cattle well enough from a distance and found the management of land and men and money to be the sort of detail work that made his temples ache. He had said without shame that Clayton was the one with the gift for it, and he had been right. Clayton had his father's height and his mother's stubbornness, and a mind that could hold the price of beef futures, the depth of 3 different water tables, and the exact wording of a grazing rights agreement simultaneously. He had a seriousness to him that could read as cold, until you spent enough time around him to understand it was actually a form of profound concentration. He was not a man who moved fast or spoke carelessly. He thought before he acted, and he acted before he doubted. He had ridden down to the south pasture that morning, because one of the hands had reported seeing a wagon camped near the cottonwoods, and he had expected to find a drifter or a traveling family passing through and needing water. He had not expected to find a young woman in a dusty blue dress mending his fence posts with a precision that honestly impressed him. He pulled his horse up and looked at her for a moment. She looked at him with complete calm, did not drop the pliers, did not step back, and said, "Good morning. I would appreciate it if you stayed on your side of the line until I am finished. I will be done in about 2 minutes." Clayton blinked. "That is my fence line," he said. "That post is on my side of it," she said, not looking up. He got down from his horse and crouched and looked at where the post base sat relative to the wire. He had to admit she was not wrong. The post had fallen onto the east side of the wire by about 8 inches, which put it technically on the strip of land that began right there. He looked up at her again. "Who are you?" he said. She pulled the wire taut, twisted the end, tucked it, and straightened. She pulled off one glove and extended her hand to him with a directness that was unusual, and he had to admit to himself somewhere behind his professional judgment, rather striking. "Effie Lawson," she said. "My father Edmund Lawson purchased 120 acres in this county in 1871. I have the deed in my wagon. I am here to work the land." He shook her hand because there was nothing else to do. "Clayton Barker," he said. "My family has ranched the property to the west of that line for 22 years. Then we are neighbors," she said. He studied her. She studied him back without flinching. "Your wagon is broken," he said finally, because he could see the tilted profile of it through the trees. "The axle cracked yesterday. I also need a farrier for my left mare." He straightened. He had 1,000 things to attend to and no particular reason to involve himself in the problems of a woman who had just told him, more or less pleasantly, to stay on his side of a fence while she fixed it. But something about the steadiness of her kept him standing there, turning his hat in his hands, feeling an unusual reluctance to simply ride back to his own concerns. "Millrace Creek runs through my land before it reaches this stretch," he said. "You are welcome to water your horses from it until you have things sorted." "That is kind," she said. "Thank you," and she turned back to the fence. He rode back to the ranch house and spent 20 minutes staring at the books for the South Pasture lease and not reading a single number. He sent his hand, a steady older man named Rupert, back down to the cottonwoods that afternoon with a spare axle from the barn and a message that if she needed a farrier, the man who shod all the Barker horses came through every Tuesday, and this was a Monday. She sent back a note, written in a surprisingly neat and decisive hand, that said, "Thank you for the axle. I will pay for it in labor or goods when I have the means. Regarding the farrier, I would be grateful." He folded the note and put it in his coat pocket and told himself it was because it confirmed the agreement. The farrier came Tuesday and shod Dolly and the other mare, whose name was Pearl, and charged Effie 60 cents. She paid him from her dwindling stock of coins and did not mention it to anyone. By Wednesday, she had gotten the wagon back on its wheels with Rupert's help and moved it to the basin area she had identified. By Thursday, she had walked every inch of the 120 acres with a survey rod she had fashioned from a straight cottonwood branch, confirming the boundaries against her father's deed measurements. By Friday, she had identified the best site for a homestead building, a slight rise 40 feet south of the basin that would put the structure above the flood line and catch the morning sun. Clayton rode out again on Friday, which he told himself was because the South Pasture fence ran close to her property and he wanted to check it. He found her at the rise, driving stakes in the ground with a rock because she did not have a mallet. He watched her for a moment from his horse. There was something almost painful about the sight of her working alone with a rock because she did not have the right tools. Not because she was weak, she was not. She was doing it effectively and without complaint, but because the aloneness of it was vivid. "You are planning to build," he said. "I am planning to build," she confirmed, driving another stake. "Alone. That appears to be the situation, yes." He got down from his horse. He picked up the spare stake nearest to her and looked at it. "Where does this one go?" She looked at him for a long moment, that assessing look he was coming to recognize. Then she pointed to a spot 8 feet southeast. "Exactly there," she said. He walked to the spot and drove the stake with one clean strike of the rock. She watched him do it. He handed the rock back to her. "I could send Rupert down with a mallet," he said. "You could," she agreed, with a faint quality that was not quite a smile but was in the same general neighborhood. He sent Rupert with a mallet and a hand saw and a box of square nails, and told himself he was being neighborly in the way any decent man would be neighborly. Over the following week and a half, Clayton found reasons to ride to the South Pasture almost every day. Sometimes he brought tools. Once he brought extra lumber from a pile left over from a repair to the Barker barn. He did not offer to build for her, because something told him she would not want that, but he made materials available and he would occasionally stand near a problem she was working through and think out loud about how he might approach it, and she would listen and then do whatever she had decided to do, which was sometimes his suggestion and sometimes something smarter. She was building a small cabin, sensible dimensions, single room to start, with a plan for adding on. She worked from sunup to well past midday before the heat forced rest, and then worked again from late afternoon until dark. She cooked simple meals over a fire she kept small and controlled even in the dry summer air. He had never met a woman quite like her. He had met women who were tough in the particular way that frontier life forced on people, but Effie Lawson's toughness was not forced. It was original. She was not surviving despite being a woman alone in wild country. She was simply living as herself, competently, in the country she had chosen. They talked during those visits with an increasing ease that surprised him. She asked about the Barker land history, and he told it honestly, including the hard years after his father died, the drought of 1875 that had cost them a third of their herd, the decision to shift to a mixed operation with crops along the creek bottom. She told him about growing up following a surveyor father, about reading land the way other children read books, about the promise she had made. "Were you close to him?" Clayton asked one evening when he had stayed later than usual, sitting on an upturned crate near her fire while she stirred a pot of beans. "He was my whole family," she said simply. "That is different from close. Close implies you have options." He turned his hat in his hands. "I understand that," he said. "My mother died when I was 12. It was my father and 4 brothers after that. You love what you have." She looked at him over the fire. "You love what you have," she repeated quietly, as if testing the weight of it. He rode home that night with the feeling of a man who has been handed something fragile and is terrified of dropping it. At the end of the second week, trouble arrived from the direction he should have anticipated. Preston Calhoun rode out to the Barker Ranch house on a hot Tuesday morning and asked to see Clayton. Preston was 38, lean as wire, with pale eyes and the particular manner of a man who had grown up expecting the world to arrange itself around his convenience. He was the grandson of Silas Calhoun, who had sold Edmund Lawson the land in 1871. The Calhoun family had originally held vast acreage throughout Barrow County, and they had been selling and leveraging and sometimes quietly reclaiming pieces of it for decades. Preston sat in the Barker parlor and accepted a cup of coffee and told Clayton, in the smoothest and most genial tone possible, that he had a problem. "The woman on your south border," he said. "Effie Lawson." Clayton set down his coffee cup very carefully. "What about her?" "Her father took a loan against that land in 1874, Preston said. "From the Harlow Creek Land Trust, which at the time was administered by my grandfather. The loan was $412. It was never repaid. The land deed your neighbor is holding is valid only insofar as the original debt does not supersede it, and the courts in this county have consistently held that it does." Clayton looked at him steadily. "You are saying the Calhoun family has a legal claim on her land." "I am saying the Harlow Creek Land Trust, of which I am now the principal beneficiary, has a lien on that property that was not discharged. If Miss Lawson cannot pay the outstanding balance in 30 days, the land reverts to the trust." Preston smiled pleasantly. "I thought you should know, as her neighbor." After Preston left, Clayton sat in the parlor for a long time. Then he rode down to Effie's building site. She was up on a wall frame measuring a header beam. He stood below and called up to her, and she climbed down, and he told her everything Preston had said. He watched her face as he spoke. It did not crumple or panic. It went still, the way a person's face goes when they are absorbing a blow and refusing to be destroyed by it. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes went to the middle distance. When he finished, she was quiet for nearly a full minute. "My father never mentioned a loan," she said. "That does not mean he did not take one," Clayton said carefully. "It means he may not have told you about it." She looked at him. "Do you believe it is legitimate?" "I believe it is worth verifying," he said. "I know a lawyer in Harlow Creek, a man named Aldous Finch. He is a straight shooter. I would like to take the deed and the documents your father left you to him and have him examine them." "Why?" she said. He met her eyes. "Because $412 and a claim made by Preston Calhoun in the 4th generation after the original sale smells like something I would want examined carefully before I accepted it." She studied him with that look that always made him feel she was reading him the way she read land, surface features and underlying geology simultaneously. "You have known Preston Calhoun a long time," she said. "Long enough," he said. "Has he done this before?" "Made claims on land other people thought was theirs." Clayton was quiet for a moment. "There was a family named Driscoll," he said, "about 6 years ago. They had a homestead claim on 40 acres east of town. A lien appeared, they could not pay it. The land became part of the Calhoun holdings." He paused. "The Driscolls left the county." Effie absorbed this. "I see," she said quietly. "You are not the Driscolls," he said. She looked up at him, and there was something in her expression that was gratitude and pride tangled together so tightly they almost looked like pain. "No," she said, "I am not." She gave him the canvas bag of her father's documents that evening. He carried it to Aldous Finch's office in Harlow Creek the following morning, and spent 3 hours sitting across from the old lawyer, while Finch spread the papers on his desk, and read every one with his spectacles low on his nose and his expression professionally neutral. At the end of it, Finch removed his glasses and polished them and said, "The deed is legitimate. Your father's sale to Edmund Lawson in 1871 was properly recorded, and I can confirm it in the county records. The loan document Preston Calhoun is referencing exists. Yes, Edmund Lawson did borrow $412 against the land in September of 1874. The note was drawn through the Harlow Creek Land Trust." "But," Clayton said, because Finch had paused with intention. "But the note specifies a repayment term of 10 years, Finch said, "which means the debt does not mature until September of 1884. It is presently July of 1878. Preston Calhoun's claim that the debt is due in 30 days is not supported by the document itself unless he can demonstrate a default condition, which would require proof of non-payment of annual installments." Finch looked at Clayton over his desk. "Do we have any record of whether Edmund Lawson paid those installments?" Clayton went back to Effie with this question. She went through her father's papers with him, and they sat together at her camp table in the half-finished cabin going through receipts and ledger pages and letters for the better part of an afternoon. Their heads closed together over the documents, and Clayton became acutely aware of the warm smell of her hair, and the way she occasionally bit her lower lip when she was concentrating. They found, in an envelope tucked into the back lining of her father's Bible, 4 receipts. 4 annual payments, 1874 through 1877, $41 each, made to the Harlow Creek Land Trust and signed by a trust officer named Beaumont who had since died. The receipts were faded but legible. Effie held the last receipt in both hands and stared at it. "He was paying," she said quietly. "He was paying every year, he just never told me about the loan." "Because he was ashamed of it," Clayton said gently. She looked up at him. Her eyes were very bright. She did not cry, but she was close to it, and the not crying was visible as its own kind of effort, and he had the nearly overwhelming instinct to reach across the table and take her hand. He did not yet. "Preston Calhoun knows about these receipts," she said. "He must. He is the trust beneficiary. He knows the loan is not in default." "He is banking on you not knowing," Clayton said. "He is banking on a woman alone without a lawyer not knowing to look for the receipts." Her jaw set. "Then we show the receipts to Aldous Finch and Finch writes a letter." "Already asked him," Clayton said. "He will write it today. He will also file a notice with the county clerk confirming the deed's standing and the loan's current status. It will put Calhoun on record as having made a false claim if he pursues it." She looked at him for a long moment. "You went ahead of me," she said. There was a note in her voice he could not quite parse. "I did," he said. "I should have asked first. I am sorry." She was quiet. Then, "No, thank you. I am not used to having help." She paused. "I'm not entirely sure I know what to do with it." "You do not have to do anything with it," he said. "Just let me know if it works." It did work, or it should have, but Preston Calhoun was not finished. Clayton found out about the next move 2 days later when his second brother Wade came back from Harlow Creek with a tight expression and said he had heard something at the dry goods store that Clayton needed to know. Wade was the brother who moved through town most, who knew people and heard talk, and his instinct for useful information was reliable even if his inclination to offer unsolicited opinions was less welcome. What Wade had heard was this. Preston Calhoun had been telling people in town that the Barker family was allowing a squatter to occupy disputed land on their south border, and that the Barkers had to be mixed up in it somehow, because no reasonable man would take a stranger's side against an established family without some personal interest. And the way Calhoun said personal interest made it mean something ugly. Clayton heard this and went very quiet in the specific way that, as all four brothers knew, was more alarming than shouting. "He is trying to make it about you," Wade said. "About the two of you. He is trying to make the story be that you are protecting her for wrong reasons so that even if the legal claim fails, she cannot stay here without every man in the county looking at her crooked." "I know what he is doing," Clayton said. "Then you know the cleanest thing might be to step back," Wade said, not unkindly. "Let Finch handle it legally, keep your name out of it, and leave her to face the talk alone." Wade spread his hands. "I am telling you what the cleanest move is. I am not saying it is the right one. That was when the brothers' meeting happened. That was when all four of them sat around the pine table and Hector laid out the risk to the Barker family standing in the county, and Wade analyzed the angles, and Emmett worried quietly, and young Cass sat silent, and Clayton looked at every one of them and said what he said. She chose this land and nobody is making her leave it. He walked out into the July night and stood on the porch for a long time, looking south toward the line of cottonwoods he could not see in the dark but knew were there, and feeling the shape of what was happening inside him with the same careful attention he gave to everything important. He was in love with her. He had been, he thought, since the moment she told him to stay on his own side of the fence while she finished her work. It had arrived not as a sudden thing but as a recognition, the way you recognize a landmark you have seen in a drawing and understand you are now standing in the actual place. This is real. This is the thing itself. He went to see Effie the next morning. She was at her cabin again, fitting a window frame she had fashioned from the leftover lumber, and she listened to everything he told her about what Calhoun was saying around town with that same still attention she gave to bad news. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, then she said, "He is trying to make me a scandal." "Yes," Clayton said. "Because a legal fight he cannot win," she said. "Yes." She set down the window frame and dusted her hands. "Clayton," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they both felt it. "I want you to know that you do not have to be part of this. You have done more than any neighbor was obligated to do. If standing further back protects your family, I understand that." He looked at her steadily. "I know you understand it," he said. "I also know you would never ask me to stay. I am staying because I am choosing to. Can you understand that distinction?" She held his gaze. Something in her face shifted, a careful guard going down an inch, 2 inches. "I am trying to," she said quietly. "Try harder," he said, and it came out gentler than he expected. She almost smiled. It was quick and she pulled it back, but he had seen it, and he carried it with him the whole way back to the ranch. He rode into Harlow Creek the following Monday and went first to Aldous Finch's office, and then to the office of the Barrow County Recorder, and spent 3 hours establishing, with Finch's help, a recorded affidavit confirming the legitimacy of Effie Lawson's deed, the status of the loan payments, and the falsity of Calhoun's default claim. Finch also drafted a formal letter to Preston Calhoun informing him that any further attempts to misrepresent the status of the Lawson land claim would be met with a lawsuit for slander of title, a real legal instrument that Finch assured Clayton had good standing in Texas courts. Clayton sent the letter by hand, carried it himself to the Calhoun house on the edge of town, and delivered it to Preston Calhoun's front door. Calhoun read it on his own porch with Clayton standing on the step and his pale eyes moving over the lines and his jaw getting progressively tighter. "You are making an enemy," Calhoun said when he finished. "You made it first," Clayton said. I am just making it official." He rode home in the long summer afternoon and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but was somewhere between them, something like rightness, the sensation of having done the thing that needed doing. He did not see Effie for 2 days after that, both of them busy with their respective work, and the 2 days had a strange, stretched quality to them, as though time was measuring itself differently than it had before. When he rode down to the south pasture on Wednesday evening, he found her on the roof of the cabin, setting the final ridge pole. She looked completely comfortable 15 feet off the ground, moving along the roof boards with a balance he found both alarming and admirable. "You are going to kill yourself," he said from below. "I have been on higher roofs than this," she said without looking down. "That is not the reassurance you think it is." She drove the last nail, checked the ridge pole's seat, and climbed down the ladder with easy confidence. At the bottom rung she turned and found herself closer to him than either of them had planned, the ladder having been placed near where he stood, and for a suspended moment they were near enough that he could see the exact color of her eyes in the late light, which was not simply brown but brown with a warm center, like firelight seen from outside a window. Neither of them moved for a second or two longer than the moment required. "The roof is done," she said finally. "So I see," he said. "The cabin will be habitable within the week," she said. "I want to thank you for everything. The materials, the tools, Aldous Finch." She paused. "Going to Calhoun's door yourself?" "Heard about that," he said with a very slight smile. "Word travels," she said. "It does." He turned his hat in his hands, that habit she had come to know. "Effie," he said, and stopped. She waited. "I would like to call on you properly," he said. "If you are willing, I would like to come to your door with honest intention and have you know what that intention is." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What is the intention?" He looked at her directly, with all the concentration he brought to things that mattered. "To know you better," he said, "with the hope of something permanent." Her breath shifted almost imperceptibly. "That is a very honest declaration," she said. "I am not a subtle man," he said. "No," she said slowly, with the quality that was almost a smile, "you are not." She looked at him for a long moment. "Come to dinner on Sunday," she said finally. "I cannot promise much. A fire and some beans and whatever I can spare." "That is plenty," he said. He rode home feeling like a man who has looked over a cliff and found it was not a cliff at all but a long open valley stretching out below him. On Sunday he came to her door at 6 in the evening with a basket his housekeeper had put together before he could talk her out of the idea, corn bread and a jar of peach preserves and a small smoked ham. And Effie looked at the basket and then at him and laughed, really laughed, an open and unguarded sound that was the most beautiful thing he had heard in a long time. "I see your housekeeper does not trust my cooking," she said. "She does not trust my manners," he said. The basket was her idea. "I could have stopped her and I chose not to." "Good decision," she said, and took the basket and waved him in. The cabin was one room and it was nearly finished, the walls solid, the floor swept, a small iron stove in the corner that he recognized as having come from the Barker barn, and that he had told Rupert to offer her if she wanted it. She had a table, 2 chairs, her canvas document bag hanging on a peg, and in the corner a neat bedroll on a raised wood platform she had built herself. It was spare, but it was hers, and it had the particular quality of a place where someone has arranged their few things with care. They cooked together, more or less, her stirring the pot and him cutting the bread, talking in the easy way they had developed over the weeks. But there was a new quality to the evening, the acknowledged intention between them, and it made the air a degree warmer and the words a degree more careful. After dinner, they sat on the step outside, the night coming on with its full canopy of Texas stars, and she told him about what she planned for the land. A small herd of cattle, eventually. A kitchen garden. The natural basin graded into a stock pond. She had it mapped in her head, the way her father had taught her to hold a survey, in 3 dimensions. He listened to all of it and felt the love he was carrying for her become more specific with each detail, attached now not just to her eyes and her steadiness but to this particular vision, this woman and this land together. "You planned all of this before you even arrived," he said. "I planned the land," she said. "I did not plan everything." A small pause. "I did not plan you." He turned to look at her in the dark. She was looking at the stars. "Is that a problem?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said softly, "it is just true." He reached over and took her hand very gently, and she let him, and they sat like that on the step of her one-room cabin in the July night until the stars had turned, and the fire inside had gone to embers. The courtship that followed was conducted in the open, deliberate style of two people who were not young enough to be reckless about it, but were too far gone to be careful. Clayton came to Effie's land every second or third day, sometimes with purpose, bringing materials or news, and sometimes with no purpose at all except to sit with her in the evening and talk. They rode the boundaries of her land together, and he showed her where the Barrow County Survey markers were, and she showed him the aquifer seep she had found in the eastern corner that could be developed into a reliable water source. His brothers watched all of this with varying levels of concern. Hector, who was not a sentimental man, surprised Clayton one morning by sitting down next to him at the breakfast table and saying, "She seems solid." "She is," Clayton said, equally surprised. "The cowhound business," Hector said, rubbing the back of his neck. "I said the wrong thing at that meeting. I was thinking about the ranch when I should have been thinking about what was right. I want you to know I understood that after you walked out." Clayton looked at his oldest brother. "Thank you," he said. "Do not make a ceremony of it," Hector said, and got up and went outside. Wade came around more slowly. His concern about Effie had always been more about unknown quantities than actual hostility, and as the weeks passed and Effie's character became less unknown, his skepticism shifted into something warmer. He met her formally for the first time when Clayton brought her to Sunday dinner at the ranch house in early August, and she sat at the big table with all four brothers and answered Wade's questions with her characteristic directness, and made Emmett laugh with a dry observation about cattle prices. And by the end of the meal Wade was leaning on his forearms and arguing with her about crop rotation schedules, with the focused engagement he usually reserved for topics he found genuinely interesting. Emmett had liked her from the start, from the stories Clayton told. He told her so with his usual gentleness when he got her alone in the kitchen after dinner while they were washing dishes. "He is different since he met you," he said. "Different how?" she asked. Emmett considered. "Less like a man holding everything together by himself," he said. "More like a man who is just living." She looked at the dish in her hands for a moment. "He holds a great deal," she said quietly. "He does," Emmett agreed. "He always has. Since our father died, he has been the center of everything here. He needed something that was his own." She looked at Emmett and he saw the same careful, unsentimental honesty in her that he had heard about from Clayton. "I am nobody's anchor," she said, "but I think we might be each other's." "That is a better deal," Emmett said. Young Cass, who was 17 and largely silent at the meeting but always watching, took to Effie with the directness of youth once his older brothers had made room for it. He started finding reasons to ride to the south boundary on his own, and Effie, who had a natural ease with the young that came from years of her father bringing her along to places where she was the only person under 40, accepted his company without making a fuss of it. She showed him what she was doing with the basin grading and let him help with some of the earth moving, and within a week, he was treating her with the mix of respect and comfortable familiarity that was his best version of acceptance. Clayton noticed all of this with a deep, quiet gladness. In late August, Preston Calhoun made one more move. It was not a legal one this time. He had apparently accepted that the legal ground was not his to hold. It was social, the particular cruelty of small communities where reputation is a currency that can be counterfeited. He sent his wife to a gathering of the ladies of the Harlow Creek Church, and she repeated, in the way of someone mentioning something they would rather not mention, that there were questions about Effie Lawson's character. A woman living alone on disputed land, spending considerable time in the company of an unmarried man, with no family to vouch for her background. It was not said as accusation, exactly, just as concern. Effie found out about it because Margaret Finch, Aldous Finch's wife, was at the gathering and was a woman who believed in telling people the truth before the rumor could do more damage, and she came to the Barker Ranch house personally to tell Clayton before Effie could hear it from someone less kind. Clayton sat with this information for about 30 minutes and then rode to Effie's cabin and told her. She sat very still and looked at the table. The stillness this time was different from her usual composure. It had a different quality, older pain, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has spent years being the singular one, always unvouchable, always slightly outside the social structure that confers respectability on people with families and connections. "I knew something like this would happen eventually," she said quietly. "It will not stick," he said. "You cannot know that." "I can," he said, "because I will not let it." He paused. "Effie, I want to ask you something, and I want you to hear the whole thing before you answer." She looked up at him. "I am not asking because of Calhoun," he said carefully. "I was going to ask before this. I want you to know that clearly. Calhoun has only changed the timing, not the asking." He took a breath. "I would like you to marry me, not to fix a reputation or to give you legal standing or to protect your land claim. For every reason that does not have anything to do with any of that. Because you are the person I want to come home to at the end of every day, and I believe we are the kind of people who build well together, and I have not felt this way about any living soul before, and I do not expect I will again." She was very quiet for a long time, long enough that he felt the quality of the waiting change several times. "Clayton," she said finally. "Yes, I came here for this land," she said. "I need you to understand that. I came here for myself and for what I promised my father and for the thing I have been working toward my whole life. I did not come here for a husband." "I know," he said, "and I need the land to be mine," she said. "My name on the deed, my decisions about what is planted and where, my work." "Always," he said without hesitation. She looked at him searchingly. "Men say that before, and sometimes they mean it and sometimes they do not." "I mean it," he said. "I have watched you for 2 months. I know exactly who you are and exactly what you are building. I do not want to take it from you. I want to be part of it if you will have me as a partner. An actual one." She was quiet again. The fire in the stove made small sounds. Outside, the August evening was full of crickets. "Yes," she said quietly. "That is my answer. Yes." He crossed the room and took both her hands, and she stood up from her chair, and for a moment they simply stood very close, foreheads almost touching, both of them breathing the same air and feeling the enormity of the ordinary moment. He kissed her then, gently, with all the controlled feeling of a man who has been holding himself carefully for a long time, and she kissed him back with a warmth that was not quite what he expected, fuller and more immediate, as though she too had been holding something back, and had decided, with her characteristic decisiveness, to stop. They told the brothers at Sunday dinner the following week. Hector nodded with a satisfaction that was as close to joy as his face generally got. Wade shook Clayton's hand with genuine warmth and told Effie she was getting a man who was infuriating in his correctness, and she would need patience. Effie said she had been told she had a surplus of patience, and Wade said he found that hard to believe given what he had observed of her character, and she laughed at that, the open, unguarded laugh Clayton had been hearing more of lately. Emmett hugged her, which she allowed with a slight surprise that showed she was not much used to being hugged, but was not opposed to it. Cass went red in the face and shook her hand very seriously and told her he was glad and meant it. The wedding was held on a Saturday in September at the Harlow Creek Church, a small and quietly dignified event. Aldous Finch and his wife Margaret came. 3 of the Barker Ranch hands came. A woman named Clara Dempsey, who kept the boarding house in Harlow Creek and who had befriended Effie in the weeks of her early visits to town, came and brought her daughter. The minister, a man named Reverend Cross, was the straightforward kind who did not embellish, and the ceremony was short and exact, which suited both of them. When Reverend Cross said Clayton might kiss his bride, Clayton did so, and the small congregation made a warm noise, and Cass whistled until Hector hit him on the shoulder. Effie wore a dress she had made herself from blue calico, fitted and clean-lined, nothing fussy. She had pinned her dark hair up with 2 small white flowers from the garden at the boarding house that Clara Dempsey had offered, and she looked, in Clayton's considered opinion, like a woman who had decided to be exactly herself on her wedding day, which was more beautiful than anything more elaborate could have been. After the ceremony, when they were standing outside in the September sunlight with Clara Dempsey pressing cups of lemonade on everyone, Preston Calhoun happened to ride by on the main street. He saw the small gathering outside the church. He saw Clayton and Effie standing together. He saw the rice still in Effie's hair. He kept riding without stopping, and Clayton watched him go with a calm that was complete and final. The Calhoun chapter was closed. They established their life with the same practical energy they had each brought to it separately. Clayton's ranch and Effie's 120 acres were neighboring properties with a shared fence line, and they began working both with a coordination that was natural, because both of them thought in terms of land and water and seasons. Effie moved into the Barker Ranch house as her primary residence, as it was larger and better provisioned, but they kept her cabin, and she used it as her working base for the south property, riding down most mornings to check on the cattle she was beginning to accumulate, and the kitchen garden and the stock pond that was taking shape in the graded basin. Clayton filed the paperwork that confirmed the Southland deed was recorded jointly in both their names, though they had an understanding between them that her father's land was her own project to develop and profit from, an understanding they kept with the easy consistency of people whose private agreements do not need to be renegotiated every time someone is watching. She learned the Barker Ranch's operations with the thoroughness she brought to everything, and within 3 months she was keeping the books, which were considerably improved by her training as a surveyor's bookkeeping assistant. She found an error in the South Pasture lease agreement that had been costing the Barkers $8 a year for 4 years. Clayton stared at it when she showed him and then laughed, a real sound of genuine amusement. $32, he said. I will send them a letter, she said. Please, he said. In the late winter of that first year she discovered she was expecting. She told Clayton in the kitchen one February morning, directly and without preamble, which was entirely in character, and he set down his coffee cup and looked at her for a moment and then crossed to her and put his arms around her and held her with a tenderness that was one of the things she had come to know about him as distinct from his public self, this private softness under all the concentration and competence. Good, he said against her hair. Good, she agreed. Their son was born in October of 1879, a healthy, loud-voiced boy they named Edmund for her father and called Ed. The birth was attended by the doctor from Harlow Creek and by Clara Dempsey, who had become a genuine friend of Effie's, and it went as well as such things could go. And by the time the autumn morning was over, Clayton was sitting in the chair by the bed with his son in his arms, looking at Effie with an expression of stupefied gratitude that she found both endearing and somewhat amusing. He looks like you, she said. Everyone will say he looks like me, Clayton said. They always say that. He does though, she said. He has your eyes, Clayton said, looking down at the infant. He has extremely unfocused eyes right now, she said. We cannot make claims yet. He looked up at her with a smile she had come to love, the full one that he saved, as far as she could tell, exclusively for her. However his eyes turn out, he said, he is going to be exactly right. Ed Barker grew up to have his mother's dark eyes and his father's serious brow and both their stubbornness, which in combination was a force of nature by the time he was old enough to walk. He followed Effie around her south property from the age he could toddle, and she carried him on her back when the terrain required it without slowing down, and he learned to read land the way she had learned, from proximity to someone who was always doing it. The south property grew in those years. Effie's cattle herd reached 40 head by 1882. The stock pond had been in operation since 1880, and in the drought summers proved its worth 3 times over. The natural basin collection augmented by a diversion channel she had designed from the aquifer seep in the eastern corner, a project she and Clayton had dug together over 2 springs with the help of 2 ranch hands and Cass, who by then was 19 and a steady worker. Wade got married in 1881 to a woman from Amarillo named Rose who was, to everyone's slight astonishment, approximately as direct and no-nonsense as Effie, and the 2 women got along with the particular ease of people who have no use for certain kinds of social performance. Hector remained confirmed in his bachelor state, which seemed to suit him, and he and Effie had arrived at a mutual respect that was slightly formal and entirely genuine. Preston Calhoun, as it turned out, had overextended the trust into bad investments in 1880 and was forced to sell off several parcels of the family's remaining land to cover the losses. He left Barrow County in 1882 and went east, and the Harlow Creek Land Trust was dissolved and its remaining holdings sold at public auction. Aldous Finch attended the auction as a matter of professional interest and sent Clayton a note afterward that said simply, "The Lawson-Leon note was among the assets sold. The buyer was a cattle company from Fort Worth with no interest in land claims. It is effectively dead." Clayton read the note to Effie, and she sat with it for a moment, and then folded it and put it in the document bag, where she kept all the papers that mattered. In the spring of 1883, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara, after the boarding house keeper who had been such a friend in the early years, and who had become Ed's preferred person after his parents for her willingness to give him extra cornbread and tell him entirely improbable stories. Ed, at 3 1/2, regarded the baby with a combination of suspicion and proprietary interest that resolved itself within a month into a fierce protectiveness that Clayton observed with quiet recognition. His son was going to be that kind of person, the one who puts himself between. Effie's 120 acres were fully operational and profitable on their own terms by 1883. She had developed a reputation in the county as someone who understood land and water in a technical way beyond most ranchers, and she was occasionally consulted by neighbors on questions of drainage and aquifer access, which she found useful because good neighbors were worth cultivating. She had also, quietly and without making a social occasion of it, helped 2 families who were experiencing what she recognized as the early stages of a Calhoun-style legal pressure from other opportunists to have their documents examined by Aldous Finch before the situations could progress. Finch, who was in his 60s and beginning to think about passing his practice to someone younger, made a remark to Clayton one afternoon that the county would do well to have Effie Lawson Barker's understanding of land law formalized in some capacity, and that the world had not yet made sufficient room for the sort of mind she had, and Clayton agreed with a complete and uncomplicated pride. He was proud of her every day. He told her so with varying frequency and varying words, but she knew it as a constant, the way you know the temperature of your own hands. In the evenings after the children were in bed and the work was done, they had a habit of sitting on the porch of the ranch house in the summer or by the big fire in the parlor in the winter, and talking or reading or sitting in companionable quiet. Clayton had taken to reading more than he had before Effie, partly because she read constantly in whatever spare minutes she had, and partly because the books she recommended turned out to be genuinely interesting. She had brought a small library in her original wagon, tucked under the seat, which he had not noticed until weeks after he first met her and which seemed, in retrospect, to have been entirely predictable. There was an evening in the autumn of 1883, a Sunday after Emmett and his new wife, a gentle woman named Frances who was a schoolteacher, had been to dinner, and the children were both asleep, that Effie sat on the porch looking south toward the dark line of cottonwoods and said nothing for a long time. Clayton, who had learned to read her silences as well as her words, waited. "Do you remember when you came down to the south pasture and found me mending your fence post?" she said finally. I remember everything about that morning, he said. She smiled at that, the small one first. I was so frightened, she said. He looked at her in surprise. Not of you, she said quickly. Of the whole situation. 2 horses, a broken wagon, all of my father's papers in a bag, and no certainty at all that any of it would come to anything. I had been so certain for so long, kept being certain through every hard day of the journey, and then the axle broke and I was 12 miles from anything, and I thought, this is where it ends. This is where I find out that certainty is not enough. He was quiet, watching her. And then a man I had never seen rode up on a horse, she said, and instead of telling me to leave or asking what business I had there, the first real thing he did was crouch down and look at where the fence post sat and acknowledge that I was right about the property line. She paused. I cannot explain what that meant to me. After everything. That the first thing was just, you are right about where the line is. He reached over and took her hand, the way he had on that first evening on this step, except that now she turned her hand over to hold his back, without hesitation. You were right about the line, he said. I was right about a great many things, she said, with that quality that was fully a smile now, clear and warm. And he leaned over and kissed her temple, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat like that while the night pressed itself softly around the ranch, and the cottonwoods were somewhere in the dark doing what cottonwood trees did, silver-leafed and persistent by the waterline. The years settled into a life that was full rather than easy, which was the appropriate distinction. 1884 brought a hard winter that took 12 head of cattle from Effie's south herd, and delayed the spring planting by 3 weeks. 1885 brought the debt note's original maturity date and the pleasant absence of any consequence, since the Harlow Creek Trust was long dissolved and its records scattered. Aldous Finch retired that year and handed his practice to a young man named Garrett who had studied law in Austin and who came to understand very quickly that the Barkers were people worth knowing, and that Effie Barker's land documents were among the most impeccably maintained in the county. Ed started school in Harlow Creek in 1885 and discovered that he had his mother's head for numbers and his father's quality of making other children feel that things would be managed, which resulted in him being the unofficial keeper of peace on the schoolyard before he was 8 years old. Clara, at 2, was a person of tremendous opinions and excellent balance, and a disposition that charmed and also slightly terrified everyone, including occasionally her parents. Emmett and Frances had a son in 1885, a boy named George who was 6 months younger than Clara and who became her first best friend, as the cousins were together frequently enough that they learned to walk in each other's company before they were properly walking at all. Hector surprised everyone in 1886 by meeting a widow named Josephine who had come to Harlow Creek to live with her sister, a woman of 35 with 2 older children, and an uncompromising quality that everyone in the family recognized immediately as the variety of person Hector could actually respect. The courtship was brisk by normal standards, which was perhaps the only thing about Hector that had ever been brisk, and by the spring of 1887 there was a second wedding in the family, smaller than the first and held at the ranch house because Josephine had no patience for ceremony, at which Effie stood beside Hector's chosen partner with a genuine warmth that cemented a friendship between them that would last the rest of both their lives. Clayton was 38 in 1887. He was as he had always been in the essentials, concentrated and steady, and not given to excess speech. But there was a difference from the man Effie had met on the south fence line, something more relaxed in the fundamental posture, as though the continuous effort of holding everything together single-handed had been quietly redistributed across a life that now included a partner at the center of it. He still rose before dawn. He still kept the books and managed the land with the same scrupulous attention, but in the evenings he laughed more. He told stories to Ed and Clara at bedtime with a narrative gift nobody had suspected until it had a proper audience. He held Effie's hand at Sunday dinners when the family was around the table, absently, without thinking about it. And she led him absently, without thinking about it, which was its own form of the deepest ease. In the spring of 1888, their third child was on the way, and this time the pregnancy was more demanding than the first two, a fact Effie accepted with characteristic practicality, and Clayton watched with characteristic worry, which she told him did not help, and he continued doing anyway because some things do not yield to reason. Dr. Harlow, the county physician, was a careful man who took the situation seriously and visited monthly, and on one of these visits told Effie she should reduce her physical work on the south property for the final months and let the hands manage more. She did this with less resistance than Clayton expected, which told him she had made the calculation herself and arrived at the same conclusion before the doctor said it. "You were already planning to do this," he said, the evening after the doctor's visit. "I was," she confirmed from the comfortable chair he had moved into their bedroom so she could sit at the window and read or look at the south land. "You could have just told me." "I know," she said, "but letting the doctor say it saved us a certain amount of conversation about whether I was doing it because I wanted to or because I felt I had to, and that conversation would have taken 30 minutes we could spend on something more interesting." He stared at her. Then he sat down on the edge of the bed and laughed until she threw a book at him. Their third child arrived in August of 1888, another son, delivered without crisis on a hot summer night while Ed, who was 8, sat very solemnly on the porch with Emmett and did not say he was frightened. They named the boy Franklin, which had been Clayton's father's middle name, and a thing Clayton had been quietly carrying in the back of his mind for years. And Effie had heard the name in the family's stories enough to understand the weight of the choosing. Franklin Barker was, from the first days, loud and sunny, and apparently determined to be different from his siblings in every navigable way. He slept when he chose to and not when anyone else chose. He found everything amusing, and he reached out his small fist at Ed's nose on their first meeting with a cheerful belligerence that made Ed sit back on his heels and say to Clayton with complete sincerity, "I think he is going to be difficult." "Probably," Clayton said, "like Mama when she is working on something." "I heard that," Effie said from the bed with her eyes still closed. "It was meant as a compliment," Ed said carefully. "Then it is taken as one," she said. The south property, Effie's 120 acres, had by 1889 been formalized in her sole name as a separate operating entity from the Barker Ranch, a thing they had structured with Garrett the lawyer in a way that was both legally sound and personally important. The land her father had bought in 1871, the land he had paid his quiet annual installments on through lean years, the land he had pressed into his daughter's hands with a dying man's instruction, was hers in every way the law and the world could make a thing hers. And she had made it productive and real and alive with cattle and water and good managed soil, and the promise she had made was kept. She stood on the rise above the basin one September evening in 1889, the same slight rise where she had driven stakes with a rock 11 years before, and looked at the pond below where the water caught the last of the sun, and at the cattle moving along the south fence, and at the small original cabin she had built with her own hands still standing solid on its foundation, currently used for storage and occasionally by Rupert when he was working the south boundary. Ed was beside her, 12 years old now and as tall as her shoulder, reading the land with her eyes in a way that needed no instruction. "The pond is fuller this year than last," he said. "Better rainfall distribution," she said. "And the eastern channel is working better since we cleared the debris in the spring." He nodded, studying the basin the way she had taught him to, looking for what the land itself was telling. "Mama," he said after a moment, "yes. Was it hard, coming here alone like you did?" She considered the question with the honesty she always gave his questions. "Some of it was hard," she said. "The not knowing was hard. Riding in and not being sure whether anything your grandfather had left you was what it was supposed to be, whether the land would be what you imagined it, whether you could build what you were seeing in your head." She paused. But the doing was not hard. The doing was just work, and work I knew how to do. He was quiet for a moment. Were you scared of us, of the Barkers, when Papa came to the fence that first morning? She smiled at the horizon. I was not scared of him, she said. I was a little uncertain, the way you are uncertain about anything you cannot yet read. But then he crouched down and looked at the fence post, and he was honest about where the line was even though it was his fence, and I thought, all right. This one is not going to be trouble. Ed considered this. He says you told him to stay on his own side of the fence. I did. He says that was when he knew. She looked at her son sideways. He says that, does he? He says it at dinner sometimes, Ed said, with the slight self-consciousness of a boy reporting a thing his father said that is about feeling and not about cattle or fence posts. When he thinks nobody notices. Effie looked south at her land and smiled the full open smile that she gave freely now in this life with these people, on this ground she had claimed and kept and made her own. He is not wrong, she said quietly. The family grew, and the years continued, each season adding its particular chapter to the accumulated wealth of the Barker Ranch, and the South property, and the community of Barrow County, which was changing as Texas changed. Towns growing and telegraph lines coming through, and the long drives of the cattle trail era giving way to railroad shipping that made the distances smaller and the market more accessible. In 1890, the Barker family welcomed Josephine's quiet observation that she was expecting, which at 40 hectare received with an expression of such pure astonished joy that everyone present agreed to pretend not to notice for the sake of his dignity. The child, a boy they named Robert, became the ranch house's loudest small resident, a situation young Franklin considered a direct personal challenge, and one he accepted with full commitment. Cass, who was now 29, had been running the eastern section of the Barker Range with increasing independence, and had been carefully courting a woman named Dinah from the neighboring Mackenzie Ranch. A romance that had taken the better part of 2 years to arrive at a formal understanding, but which, by 1891, resulted in a wedding that Clayton attended with the particular satisfaction of an older brother who has watched a shy person finally find their courage. Wade and Rose had 3 children by then, energetic and various, and the extended family that gathered at the ranch house for Sunday dinners in those years was a substantial and joyful thing, loud with children and productive with argument, and anchored by the table that Edmund Barker Sr. had built 30 years before, and which showed no signs of giving way under the accumulated weight of the family's history. Clayton and Effie turned 40 and 36 respectively in 1890, and neither of them made much ceremony of it. What Effie did in the autumn of that year was take her original canvas document bag down from the peg where it still hung in the old cabin and go through it one more time, slowly and with great care, reading every paper her father had left her. She did this alone on a Saturday morning with the cabin door open to the September air. Among the papers she found something she had not looked at closely before, a letter written in her father's hand and addressed simply to E., which she had assumed was a surveying notation, and had skimmed past in those early urgent days of finding the payment receipts and the deed. She read it now. It was 2 pages, written in the careful, deliberate script of a man who was not a natural letter writer, but was being thorough about something important. It described the land. It described what Edmund Lawson had imagined for it in 1871 when he bought it, a young man's vision of a homestead, a real base, a place that would be his family's ground after a life of following survey lines. It described the way life had not allowed him to make it real in time. And in the last paragraph, which she read twice and then a third time, it said, "I am sorry I could not do this myself. I am not sorry you are the one who will. You have always been the one who would know what to do with land. You have your grandfather's eyes for it and your own soul's stubbornness, and I have never told you often enough what it means to me to have been your father. Whatever you find when you get there, whatever it takes, do not let anyone make you small. The land does not ask you to be small. It asks you to be present. Effie sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it back in the bag and walked out of the cabin and stood in the September morning looking at her land, the pond full and shining, the cattle south along the fence, the smoke from the ranch house visible above the cottonwood line. Clayton came down on his horse at mid-morning the way he sometimes did on Saturdays when the work at the main ranch was lighter, and found her standing at the rise above the basin. He came up beside her and looked at what she was looking at. "Your father would have been pleased," he said. She had not told him about the letter yet. "Did Emmett say something?" she asked. "No," he said. "I just know what I see." She looked at him. After 11 years, she still found that the steady, particular quality of his attention, when it was on her, was one of the most grounding experiences available to her on the earth. He was looking at the land now, reading it the way he had always read land, but she knew the thought was about her father and about her and about the thing they had built here. She took his hand. He closed his fingers around hers. "I found a letter," she said. "From my father. It was in the document bag." He turned to look at her. She told him what it said. Not the exact words, not yet. Those were still sitting in her chest, settling into their permanent place, but the meaning of it. He listened the way he always listened, completely. "He knew," Clayton said when she was done. "He knew," she said. They stood on the rise for a while longer, the September sun full and warm, and below them the basin pond rippled with a small wind, and the cattle moved along their familiar patterns, and the land was exactly what it was, 120 acres of Texas ground that an impractical but not unwise man had bought in 1871 because he recognized the quality of it, and that his daughter had ridden south to claim because she had promised him, and because she was the kind of person who kept promises and understood land and did not stop for cracked axles or paper-thin legal threats or small men with old family names. It was hers. It had always been hers. And standing beside her on the rise that morning was the man who had said so the first time it needed saying, to the brothers around the pine table in the lamplight, with his fists flat on the wood and his voice level and his intention absolutely clear. She chose this land and nobody is making her leave it. He had meant every word. He always had. And she had stayed and built and made it real, and loved him back with the same completeness she gave to everything that was worth giving herself to, which was the highest standard she knew and the one she had always held. In the evenings in those years, after the children were grown enough that bedtime was their own responsibility, and the supper table had been cleared, and the lamp in the parlor burned low, and the ranch was quiet around the house, Clayton and Effie Barker sat together in the easy companionship of two people who have spent many years learning each other and have found the discovery worthwhile. He read. She sometimes read and sometimes worked through plans for the South property, and sometimes simply sat with her head back and her eyes half closed. That particular rest that was not sleep, but was the body understanding it is somewhere safe. He would look at her sometimes when she was like that and feel the gratitude of it with a freshness that 11 years had not flattened. The improbability of it. The cracked axle and the fence post, and the morning she had told him to stay on his side of the line, and he had crouched down and looked and acknowledged that she was right. The line between what had been and what might have been ran exactly there. On one side of it, his life without this woman, the life he had been living before, competent and responsible and in its own way full but missing this particular center. On the other side, everything after. He had stayed on his own side of the fence that first morning, as instructed. She had fixed her post and straightened and shaken his hand and told him her name and that she was here to work the land. He had chosen the other side of everything after that. The ranch prospered into the 1890s with the combined intelligence and labor of people who understood it deeply. Ed Barker, by the time he was 15, was genuinely useful in the management of both the main ranch and his mother's South property, and his opinion on matters of water management and soil was sought by his parents without condescension, which gave him a quality of groundedness unusual in the young. Clara was sharp-tongued and bright, and had decided by 14 that she wanted to study, and was not willing to be persuaded otherwise, a position her parents supported completely. Effie, because she knew exactly what it was to be a woman with a mind, in Clayton, because he had watched his wife manage a 120-acre property with technical skill that exceeded most men in the county, and he had no interest in arguing with what that meant for his daughter. Franklin remained sunny and loud and creative, and was, in the fullness of time, the child most likely to do something entirely unexpected with his life, which his parents viewed as the land viewing itself. You prepared the ground and you kept the water coming, and you did not try to tell a healthy growing thing what shape to take. In the spring of 1893, with Ed 17, and already carrying real management responsibility for the South herd, Effie and Clayton sat with Garrett the lawyer and made formal arrangements for the South property's future succession, a document that named Ed as the primary inheritor of the land his grandfather had bought and his mother had claimed and worked, with provisions for Clara and Franklin that were equitable and considered. Effie signed the document with her own name, Effie Lawson Barker, both names intact the way they had always been, and the signing felt like completing something that had been in motion since a dying man pressed a deed into his daughter's hands. "Your father's land," Clayton said afterward on the walk from Garrett's office back to where the horses were tied. "My land," she corrected, without sharpness but with precision. "His deed, my land." He looked at her and smiled the full smile. "Yes," he said, "exactly right." She took his arm as they walked, which was a habit of recent years, and he covered her hand with his in the September afternoon, and Harlow Creek went about its business around them, and the cottonwoods were gold along the creek, and the sky was the particular deep blue of a Texas fall that is wide enough to make you understand, without any additional argument, why a person who has been on this ground long enough does not leave it. The years passed as years do when a life is real and full, measured in seasons and harvests and children growing and neighbors coming and going, and the small particular dailiness of work that is meaningful because it builds something that was not there before. The Barker Ranch expanded carefully into the late 1890s, not aggressively, but with the patience of people who understood that good land management is not about speed. The South property remained Effie's particular domain, the pond now an established feature of the local watershed, known to neighboring ranchers as a reliable backup water source in drought years, which she made available to neighbors in the way that her husband made available what he had, with generosity that was also pragmatism, because good neighbors were worth more than any single advantage. Aldous Finch died in 1896, peacefully in his sleep, and his wife Margaret wrote to Effie a letter that said he had told her in his last year that the Lawson case was one of the 2 or 3 of his career he was proudest of, not for the legal complexity, which had been modest, but because the outcome had been right, and for once the right outcome had been the one that won. Effie read the letter at the kitchen table and passed it to Clayton and said nothing, because nothing needed saying. And so they lived, through the turn of the century and into the beginning of a new one, Clayton and Effie Barker on the Barker Ranch and the South property in Barrow County, Texas, with their children and their brothers' children, and the land that had been there before all of them and would be there after, patient and red-earthed and dry in summer and miraculous with spring grass after rain, holding the roots of cottonwood trees in its creek banks and the stakes of survey markers in its rise above the basin, and the memory of a young woman driving those stakes with a rock in the July heat of 1878, because she did not yet have a mallet, and she was not going to wait. The land did not ask her to be small. She never was. And the man who had ridden down to check a broken fence on a July morning and found something he had not known he was looking for, that man stood beside her for the rest of his life and never once, not for a single day, took for granted the fact that she had stayed.